Okay, hey, I'm Brandon Cross, the CEO of Hoyack, and today I'm going to talk in this Whiteboard Wednesday session, and I'm going to go through some cool tech that I made a long time ago, not that long ago, but I'm going to describe this technology that I made. And this is probably one of the first times I've really described this technology publicly. I referred to it as Shrubnet. I also had another component of it that I called Service Orchard. Now, this technology, I consider it to be somewhat deprecated. It's not something that I'm currently really utilizing in my day-to-day pipelines anymore. But some of the, I would say, some of the things that it evolved into are things that I'm using in my pipelines commonly. But let's just kind of, talk about like the need of where this system came from, why I started to build it. And then I'll kind of start to outline what it actually looked like and the technologies that I used to build this thing. Okay, and I think it's going to be a very interesting conversation for people that want to learn about a kind of advanced queuing-based system that would be used for doing what I called like data extraction at scale at an industrial grade. Okay, so many of the things that you're gonna encounter when you're trying to build like marketing systems and different things like that is going to be lead gen and data sources and information, okay? A lot of it comes down to information people want or need for various reasons or to launch a, kind of a business off of. Many times like information becomes the basis foundation for everything, okay? So in the internet, there's just a ton of information, and this stuff is basically like gold, okay? So, info is, I guess you could say knowledge is power and data is digital gold and stuff like that. Okay, so some years back, when I first sold my managed IT service company, I got into doing a lot of freelancing in Upwork. And at the time, I was kind of building this new sort of thing. And I didn't know what I was really building. I was just kind of just working, okay? I was just taking on just whatever jobs made sense that really fit my skills and kind of freelancing my way through. And along the way, I started noticing a lot of people, especially in Upwork, were posting jobs where they wanted data to be extracted. Now, this was oftentimes presented as make me a scraper or scrape some data and stuff like that. And so I kind of it was like, man, a lot of times, a lot of the scripting that I've done in the past was like gathering a lot of different data points from different things and kind of aggregating it together, okay? Because a lot of times you have like various databases and various lists of information, and there's different ones, right? And so there's just lots of different kinds of ways that information gets presented and stored and structured. And a lot of times you need to take all this information and bundle it up, and you need to create a data warehouse out of it, okay? And so that's connected to all of this stuff. So, the idea of, this layer where you would have to go out and you would have to hook in to the internet various ways and start to grab this data from all these different sources and bring this stuff up, and store it inside of the database was like a whole thing, okay? And then to be able to actually then send that database out to be used in some other application, okay? So there's a lot of different apps that, you might have to send that data to, and it might be completely different apps that have nothing to do with each other. That, so this information is being brought in, different sources, it's being warehoused, and then it's being used to where these apps can query subsets of this data to then run business intelligence dashboards, off of it, and, these little donut charts and bar charts and, all kinds of data patterns, and, you can do sentiment analysis, and you can do, so many different things, right? All the things that we do revolve around data many times, and so we need the ability to to warehouse this stuff. We need the ability to aggregate this information. And then in many cases, like these systems, we're doing things like, this could be like, machine learning training that's happening underneath this because of all of the data sources that are able to be brought into that. And so that's kind of, that was kind of like a foundational thing where I was like, I see a lot of people that want various data, and it just and sometimes they want like really hard to get data, and other times they want like really calm and easy to get data. And sometimes there's these data sources that are like locked down and you can't really access them because like there's certain, precedents where like if a system is protected by a username and password, then the terms of service of that site have to apply to your actions. And so if you go in there and start scraping behind usernames and passwords, it exposes some risks to some of the scrapers. And I'm not a legal expert, so I can just tell you like just the general consensus of what people seem to think, but there's always, risks pinging these kinds of systems. And so, I ended up creating a system, working on building something. Like I saw the need, right? And I started doing, like I had a client hire me to do some scraping, okay? And it was for like, I don't remember it. I think at the time it was for, like restaurant listings that you would commonly run into on a very popular platform. And so, this person had an online reputation management company, and they were like, yeah, I can get like negative reviews removed from this popular platform, especially because I used to work there and know insiders there and different things like that. I'm like, look, I don't know what you do, how you do it, whatever, but if you need the data, you need like to know how many star ratings different people have across different metrics of different sectors, of different categories of business in this popular system, then I can certainly scrape that and gather that and then make intelligent decisions based on that data. And this was so many years back, way before like machine learning stuff was like being like there was machine learning stuff, lots of it, well before the LLM revolution. And so like that was an example. And I started running into issues like, okay, I'm going to go and I'm going to start to iterate through page by page, and I'm going to go and I'm going to run a search. And like how, and then, you're using like different code for this and you're getting blocked, okay? And so I started to get into this thing where I'm like, first off, I need to collect data in such a way where I can continuously collect it and I know where I am in the collection process, and I'm able to then do like a time series refresh on it. And I'm able to store that time series data as well. And so I started out with like initially building a simple scraper. I'm going to call it a scraper 1. Okay, and this thing would hit a particular website, all right? And I don't need to say any names, but a very popular website for ranking and rating businesses, especially restaurants and stuff like that, okay? And so, you'd have like a thing where, there's like, let's say there's like a search box, and then, you have to type in a search, and then it drops a bunch of results, and then so you have to like get this list of results, each one of the URLs, and then you have to open each one of those URLs and look at the page of that specific thing, and then you have to go and collect all of that, and then you have to store that somewhere, okay, in another database, right? Or in okay, so like this was like maybe a Python script that would run. And so I wrote a Python script, and at first, this thing was using a popular Python tech library called requests, and everybody, you can make a request to a website and you can get back like an HTML format off of that, and then from that you can look at, okay, the HTML, I'm going to parse through and look for certain elements, and then you sort of store the elements, or okay, I'm going to make this search, it's going to get a list of pages, I need to then cache that list of pages, and maybe there's like page 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, so on and so forth. And so you have to paginate through those, right, and collect each one of those, And then you have to sit there and make a second stage where it goes like, this might be like the stage 1 process, and then there's like the stage 2 process, okay, right? It's just like boom, boom, right? So this was like the very first like primitive sort of thing that I started to like try to do, and storing a lot of times like these things initially in the very, very earliest iteration of this thing, this was stored as like a lot of CSV files, okay? So it's like CSV, okay? All these CSV files just sort of stacking up, okay, right? And that wasn't really a database. That was just like a bunch of CSV files, like all these different ones, right? So, but then, I started running into some issues where I would get blocked, okay? This thing would like, I'd be like, And so, first off, it's like looking at, when I'm making this request, it's looking at this thing called a user agent, okay? So my user agent, all right, is coming in, and it's like literally says my user agent is requests, Python requests. And so any reasonable system proxying traffic between the website target and the scraper is gonna look at some certain things, okay? And it's like, okay, well, then it's also looking at like the IP address as well, okay? So it's like, okay, has this IP address been making a lot of requests to me iteratively? And also, what's the user agent that's doing this too? And so like, had to resolve some of those issues. And so one of the solutions that I came up with was, all right, so what we're going to do is we're going to implement a VPN, a privacy VPN, okay, and we're going to make a privacy VPN rotation system, all right? And so what would happen is that this IP address would be in constant rotation, all right? And then we're also going to write the user agent to be, well, let's make it Chrome. And so instead of using requests, I created a thing where I started to use Selenium, all right? And so Selenium is a testing kit. It's a kit that tests, it runs like, let's say, a Chrome.exe or something like that, right? It basically, it runs a real web browser, okay? And it's able to do, like, you're able to automate that web browser to do things, and it's using a real web browser. And so when you do this, you're able to like set the user agent to where, okay, now the user agent's coming in as Chrome, and it's coming in off an IP that isn't, like just being, easy to just like block. And so then what I would do is I would be like, if this thing blocked me, then what I would do is I would rotate the IP, and I would hit it again, and it would block me, and I would rotate the IP until I found like a good IP. And so I would like brute force my way through doing IP rotation to actually like bypass the security of the anti-bot measure, right? And so and then, there was also the CAPTCHAs, right? And so it's like, all of the CAPTCHA stuff, and you'd have that. And so I had to create a thing to like beat the CAPTCHA. And so like this thing, what would happen is that when I had like a layer in my, let's call it S1, that, when a CAPTCHA came in, then that would go out to an anti-CAPTCHA service typically, okay? And so there's like all these anti-CAPTCHA APIs that then beat the CAPTCHA and bring it back in. And sometimes these CAPTCHAs are like reCAPTCHA v3, reCAPTCHA v2, various kinds of CAPTCHAs. And so usually there's like services that handle this. Like, there's particular services, if you look for like anti-CAPTCHA API, you would just buy coins basically, and then you just feed the requests in, and you just, you pay to beat the CAPTCHAs, and sometimes it's manual, sometimes it's AI, sometimes all kinds of different things. I did build an anti-CAPTCHA AI at one point that ran on my own GPUs, I did, and I did it for a particular type of CAPTCHA that was unbeatable by any of the other CAPTCHA services. But in fact, I went ahead and typically would just use the anti-CAPTCHA service. So this was like a good little system, but you know, I could do VPN rotation. And so then what I did is like I had another layer above this, right? So like these were like major things that that made a stack that like really enabled for web scraping at scale, right? And so with privacy VPN rotation, now this would be using like an open VPN type client on a privacy VPN. And so what I would do is I would buy a lot of privacy VPN accounts, all right, just a ton of privacy VPN accounts. And then what I would do is I kind of built this out as like a scalable sort of service, right? And so, and then what I did is I made it to where, okay, when it goes and it does the data collection process, okay, then it needs to send that out to another database. And so I did this thing, I used this thing called Hasura, okay, Hasura, and it was a service, and what it did is it created an API endpoint, a graph API endpoint, okay, and it then wrote that right into actually a Postgres database layer, okay? So I have this Postgres database sitting on top of Hasura. This thing makes an API call in, and the data gets dumped to the right table, okay? And so then what I would do is I had this Postgres service also being read by this other thing. And so this was a Django app, okay, that I made. Django, I can't write. So Django. So I made this Python Django app, and it would use this Postgres database that Hasura was getting, that also had access to, that was being written to by the actual scraper system when it hit, okay, right? And so like, you know, this thing was like, you know, rotating IPs, rotating user agents, beating CAPTCHAs, running Selenium. Now Selenium would be running in memory oftentimes, so it was a headless agent most of the time, which was another thing, but sometimes it couldn't be a headless agent, and other times I had to actually use like full GUI automation. And so like I actually got to the point where I was doing like, I would stand up an environment that was like a whole environment, and then I would, like a real environment, and then I would put a real web browser in it, and then I would have the clicks be done. And so like if I would have like the mouse cursor, okay, would like move, and it would have to move with a certain velocity that was random in a randomized pattern and make the clicks on the different things. And it would have to like do this in different intervals. So that way, all the logging going on the other side, no matter how intrusive, no matter if it's physically looking at to see if there's like a hand on the mouse, that this thing would beat it. And a lot of times, like the privacy VPN stuff, a lot of those IPs are data camp IPs, and so many services do block those these days. Some years ago, it wasn't really as much the case, and so it was kind of a little more of the Wild West with those IPs. There's like other proxy services and residential proxy services and things that sometimes people can use. I always wanted to do something like make like a Chrome plugin that like had like a scraper pivoting capability that everybody could install. Like it's a little hackery, but it's not like there are like legitimate plugins that like, you know, the idea originally was called Scrape Token, and I was like, you know, you're gonna have this device like a Raspberry Pi, and you're gonna, you know, run this thing inside of this encrypted thing, and then you have it on your network, and then it's just gonna, as it gets hit, it's just gonna generate you tokens. I never built that, but that was kind of like what the original thought process was. And so what I did is, what's interesting here is that I started to take like this part of the stack, and I deployed it on a cluster of Raspberry Pi devices, okay? So I put all these Pis in, okay, and I made this Raspberry Pi cluster. All right, and all it did was each one of these Pis ran Linux, okay, like a full Linux install sitting on an SD card, and then it had like each one of these guys was like plugged into like a network switch that's connected to the internet. Or actually, what I did is I had a DDWRT like a Netgear Nighthawk that was plugged up to the switch. And that I actually had connected permanently to a privacy VPN service, okay? Then each one of the pies would come through and had their own privacy VPN tunnel. Okay, so I was writing all these privacy VPNs, like 100 privacy VPN tunnels through a dedicated privacy VPN tunnel. So even if you could see where these things were connecting from, even if you could get back to that, you still couldn't resolve back to the next layer back. And even though they're all in the same room behind the same internet connection, it's not how they appear. And so like this would appear somewhere else. Each one of these would appear elsewhere in the world or the country or whatever. And I could control and corral and contain exactly how I wanted them to move. And so this created like a very heavy industrial grade scraping system. I still have all this technology. It's expensive to use this tech. Okay. So that's why like, it's not technology that like the average guy uses. Like, the tech that I built here, I think I spent almost $1 million of my own dollars making, if not more. So that's kind of like, and it's currently not even really being utilized heavily because I don't really do a lot of scraping. Like I don't maintain a lot of privacy VPN accounts. I'm not maintaining all of these, I would upgrade this a little differently. I would re-engineer and re-architect this a little differently, but this was originally how it worked. And what would happen is I then had a Rabbit MQ system right here, okay? And so what would happen is that I had a controller node, all right, just one little controller node, and so it was sitting connected to the internet. And then this Rabbit MQ, so what I would do is I then had like a user interface over here, right? And so the user could like start or stop a job, and then you could like upload a list of variables in here. So you're like, okay, I want to scrape a particular category. Like I want to scrape sushi restaurants in New York City, and that's the only thing I want. And so what I would do is this thing would then like you go to the web portal, and then you load your list up, and so that could also be driven by an API call coming in from something else. Okay, right? Like literally. And because Django easily supports API calls, right? So it's either manual or API driven. A list of variables comes in and in a particular module. And so like let's say this down here, okay, this whole part of this system, this would be like a module, all right? And so a given module would have a particular scraping sequence, a particular plan of action, certain stages, various URLs that it's going to go to. It would know, it's going to go here and it has to paginate through things and collect this or do that or do this or do that. And at the end, it's sitting there shooting records in that relate, so like each one of the items is related to a particular record in the database, right? And so now like all those come in, and then you have your data, or you have like, your API call, your webhook coming out, okay, back to your app. All right, so like this could be like, somebody else's app. And so it's like making a call in, triggering a module that's going to go and run, and then it's going to, there's some data that's going to come back in, and at that point, then when that stuff is completed, basically this thing eventually, the Rabbit would send this to the controller, then the controller would distribute that down to all the pies. So each one of these variables would get distributed to a different physical piece of hardware running a separate browser on a separate IP address with a different user agent going after a different part of the overall record and then constantly rotating. So this was sort of a Gatling gun format that could do like industrial grade data extraction at scale, and it could fire multiple modules, that did different things, that went through different stages, that got all that data in to the database, right? And then ultimately back to the app. And so that's how I powered like some apps like Property Acts that did like property protesting, would go out and scrape all of the public records, it would go and like I did some scrapers for, like large retail type scenarios, any like various patterns that were like any kind of pattern where people wanted information. And then, the thing was that this could go out and get the information, and it might take me like some hours or some days of running the system to get all the information out of a given big, large, major system. But then I had to do a data refresh on that, right? So what's the refresh velocity? How often do we need the new data, right? Because like there was one point in time where I made this thing that hit, it would hit like popular sites like Twitter and Reddit, and it would be able to, and these sites were like, they were being heavily scraped. And so Twitter ultimately, like when it turned into X, they really locked down a lot of things, and it was always really hard to do anything with Twitter. But it was like if you could find all the cache tags, for example, the $ this and the $ that, and then you could run that through and do sentiment analysis on that. And the sentiment analysis would then come back with like, oh yeah, this is negative or positive sentiment on this particular stock or something, and then you're looking at that information across multiple different systems, social network systems and discussion forums and things, and then you're able to pick up on like the sentiments and that kind of jazz, okay, and be like, oh yeah, and so like part of this thing might be like running a part of this pipeline might have like somewhere there might be like a GPU that's getting hit with, or that might be coming over here, different things to help, but there might be like GPU processing happening on the other side of the app or whatever, okay, right? Because, because you had to have a system that had a queue, okay? It needed like a management portal. It had to have a database. It needed a way to write data in. It needed to have triggers, hooks to send, to basically like to start and stop processes, and then to return data back, webhooks to set up and register, and then all of that to go in and get laid out across a bunch of hardware that's running a whole bunch of things, all right? And so like today I've evolved this, okay? This was like the first generation version of this, okay? So now today it's much evolved in that there's a lot more like AI related stuff. I'm utilizing like local AI driven models, making different API requests to those, and then and I'm not just using Selenium. I've gone way past just like simple browser automation. This is how I'm able to do things like legacy application automation, right? Where like you have a bunch of tasks that you need, agentic kind of tasks that you want to sit there and send out, and you want to distribute, these tasks across a whole bunch of like agents, and then the agents are going to have to, you're going to have to queue in that and then send it, and an agent pipeline has to run like some specialized tool that's able to like access, as an operator. Like this has turned for me in more like an operator tool, and then I've kind of like stopped doing the privacy VPN stuff, because usually the system's behind some other like internal network now running applications inside that business. Older applications maybe that don't have, this becomes an API wrapper for applications that do not have APIs. And this becomes a way to distribute the tasks and send, and this isn't like the Raspberry Pi cluster isn't the way to do it anymore. Nowadays it's like Docker containers and Kubernetes, and it's a little bit, like I say, more evolved. And so I can stand up a system and put it on somebody's application and physically automate that app, and then have all of that automation flowing back in this very complicated way, ultimately going back to the end application that needs to be just making an API call and getting a response. But all of these things have to happen between the initial like API call and the response that we were getting. So this is, and so this is what I call Shrubnet. Okay, like pretty much all of this was Shrubnet. All right, and then on this side, like this side of things, I called Service Orchard. Okay, right, and so it was like this was like the kind of the back-end processing module-based system, and it would talk to this other like data warehousing system. All right, so this is sort of the queue, the queues at scale. All right, running like nowadays, like it's like agentic modules, and it's being still doing distribution across the agentic modules that are able to do advanced things including full-blown desktop automation. Like I said, it's evolved. I'm doing more advanced things now than I was, is scraping stuff. I'm actually like driving like business critical systems that drive big revenues for companies, not just like scraping some sushi restaurants or something. And then on the other side, the data warehouse side, the Hasura Graph API, right, allows for real simple kind of pushing of data in that's completely separate from the Django app, which, nowadays I'm kind of like trying to work on like refactoring some of that, turning it less into like a dashboard and more into API driven systems and stuff. Still using MQ, still using controller node type scenarios, a little bit more load balancing going on, a lot more microservices going on. Everything you see here is now basically being containerized instead of run in like monolithic on like as a monolithic Raspberry Pi. Still have the whole entire Raspberry Pi cluster. It almost requires no maintenance. It's one of the best things I probably ever built in terms of like low maintenance. So that's an advanced data extraction system. That's an advanced agentic automation container microservice driven system. There's a lot to setting this stuff up. If somebody said, hey, I want to build this for me, it's like hundreds of hours just to configure when you know what you're doing. So, definitely something that, this thing probably has, 50,000 man hours into building all of this stuff and testing it and using it and really scaling it and maturing it. So, hopefully that gives you like some cool ideas, some thought processes, some different things, different takes than what you might normally see. This isn't something that you're really going to find presented a lot of times, I don't think, just because like the level of advancement that you have to go through to actually do all this stuff and build it and make it, it's pretty sophisticated. Like you kind of got to be pretty top tier. And so I just don't meet a lot of people in that tier level. And the people that are in that tier usually aren't talking about this stuff because it's like this stuff is just considered too valuable for them to share with you exactly how it works. Well, you know what? I don't think that, I don't have anything really to lose by telling people about this. And, I think that if somebody wants to put a system like this, whether it be internally for like driving processes in-house on some legacy app, or some web app, or whether it be like building like a scraper at scale system that's going and getting like competitive data points from a bunch of different places or something like that. Like it's a lot, I think that this system's value as like a competitive data scraping system is lesser now because of systems like Perplexity and Manus and all these guys, they already have a lot of like, I can make my own Perplexity with this, okay? By creating modular tools and having AIs calling the tools by making API calls, going in here and doing all this. Okay, if somebody wants to set up something like that, I can build it. All right, I've already got all the code to basically do it and everything. So it's like, this is, these kind of systems are what we're seeing powering these very advanced tool-driven stuff. Like, your Grok tooling are going through a system like this. OpenAI's, search tools, deep search tools and all this, they're going through tools like this, okay? Like systems like this power the AI tooling stuff, which is kind of like, originally I was going after the data so that I could try to train the models, and now I have the system, that same system has kind of been converted into AI tooling type systems, and then we're starting to get into the MCP paradigms and, with the tooling and stuff like that. So really interesting stuff. And stuff I definitely love to talk about. But that's all I've got for today. I hope you found it interesting. Brandon Cross with Hoyack.